Hi everyone, and welcome back to Retro Legends. In the mid-1990s, the video game industry experienced one of its most radical turning points. It wasn't just a new generation of consoles, but a cultural, technological, and commercial fracture. For the first time, two opposing visions of the future of video games clashed head-on. On one side, Nintendo, the guardian of a tradition based on total hardware control and making the gameplay experience the absolute priority. On the other, Sony, a giant of electronics that entered the market with a completely new approach, more open, more aggressive, and closer to the global entertainment industry. The result of this clash took shape in two machines destined to define an era, Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. What followed wasn't just a console war, but an ideological battle that forever redefined the way video games were made, distributed, and played. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Let's get started. The collaboration project between Nintendo and Sony was born in a precise context in the early 90s. Nintendo dominated the console market, but began to perceive the physical limitations of cartridges. The high production costs and limited memory capacity risked becoming a hindrance, especially in the face of the increasing complexity of games. Sony, on the other hand, possessed advanced expertise in the optical media sector, and was looking for a credible entry point into the video game industry. The agreement provided for the development of a CD-ROM unit compatible with the Super Nintendo, known internally as PlayStation. From a contractual point of view, however, the agreement had a critical element. Sony would retain control over the licenses of games published on CD. This detail, initially underestimated, directly conflicted with Nintendo's business model, based on total vertical control of the supply chain, from hardware production to software distribution. When Nintendo understood the long-term implications of the agreement, it reacted drastically. The breakup did not happen in private, but publicly, during an international fair, when Nintendo announced a new partnership with Philips, excluding Sony without warning. The decision was not only strategic, but symbolic. It marked the end of any possibility of collaboration, and put Sony in the position of having invested resources, time, and reputation in a project suddenly denied. Within Sony, that episode created an internal rift. The division that had supported the project was initially opposed by company management, who considered the video game sector marginal and risky. However, the humiliation suffered strengthened the determination of a part of the management, convinced that Sony now possessed all the necessary skills to compete directly. The choice to develop an autonomous console was therefore not an impulsive reaction, but a strategic re-elaboration. Sony analyzed the market and identified two structural criticalities in the Nintendo model. The future PlayStation was designed to eliminate both of these obstacles, offering a simple architecture, accessible development tools, and reduced publication costs. At this point, the real historical turning point occurred. Sony stopped thinking of the console as a toy and began to conceive it as a multimedia device, placed in the living room next to stereos, CD players, and televisions. Video games were treated as an adult entertainment product, integrated into a broader industrial strategy, while Nintendo remained anchored to a more traditional identity. From that moment on, the conflict was no longer just about two companies, but two opposing models of control, openness, and vision for the future of the medium. A fracture born from a contract and destined to reshape the entire industry. The choice of storage medium represented one of the sharpest points of divergence between the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation, because it directly influenced every phase of video game production, from design to distribution. Nintendo continued to use cartridges not out of technological inertia, but to preserve a proven industrial model. Cartridges allowed immediate access to data, completely eliminating loading times and enabling a continuous gameplay flow. an element considered central to the gaming experience. From a production standpoint, cartridges offered Nintendo total control. Each medium had to be physically produced, approved, and distributed under direct license. This system limited piracy and guaranteed high-quality standards, but introduced high costs and significant risks for developers. The anticipated production of cartridges required precise sales estimates. An error could result in significant economic losses. The CD-ROM adopted by Sony operated on opposite principles. Its much larger storage capacity allowed for extensive use of digital audio, pre-rendered videos, and heavier graphical assets. The extremely low unit cost allowed for flexible print runs and drastically lowered the entry barrier for third parties. Developers could take more risks, experiment with new genres, and quickly adjust distribution based on market demand. This difference had direct consequences on game structure. On the Nintendo 64, space limitations forced extremely efficient design. Teams were compelled to compress data, reuse assets, and focus on solid mechanics and refined level design. The result was slower production, but often characterized by a high level of polish. On PlayStation, the available space, however, favored the proliferation of narrative content, cinematic sequences, and orchestrated soundtracks, elements that helped redefine the language of video games at the time. Development management also proved to be profoundly different. Nintendo, by maintaining control over cartridges, indirectly limited the number of titles published on its console. Sony, thanks to the CD, created an open and scalable ecosystem where production volume became a competitive advantage. The console was no longer just a technological platform, but a meeting point for developers of very different sizes. In strategic terms, the choice of medium reflected two incompatible visions. Nintendo defended a model based on the centrality of the gaming experience and the protection of its brand. Sony aimed for market expansion, rapid dissemination, and the breaking down of production barriers. The storage medium was therefore not a simple technical detail, but the foundation upon which two radically different ecosystems were built, destined to produce lasting effects on the entire video game industry. From a hardware architecture perspective, the Nintendo 64 was designed as an advanced system, strongly focused on three-dimensional rendering. The collaboration with Silicon Graphics led to the integration of a graphics processor capable of handling complex effects directly in hardware. The rendering system supported bilinear texture filtering, anti-aliasing, and sophisticated depth management, significantly reducing visual artifacts like jagged edges and flickering. This setup favored stable and consistent visual output, but introduced a complex graphics pipeline. The main memory, shared between CPU and GPU, required extremely careful resource management. Much of the graphics operations depended on custom microcode, which had to be written or adapted by the developers themselves. This significantly increased development times and made it difficult to fully exploit the hardware without deep technical expertise. PlayStation followed an opposite philosophy. Its hardware was less sophisticated in terms of rendering, but featured a more straightforward structure. The graphics processor was specialized in the rapid handling of polygons and sprites, with a simplified pipeline that allowed for predictable results without excessive manual optimization. The absence of texture filtering and hardware anti-aliasing reduced computational load and made the graphics behavior more linear. This simplicity was reflected in the development tools. Sony provided clear libraries, APIs, and documentation, reducing the learning curve for teams. Even studios with limited resources were able to quickly achieve functional results, focusing on content rather than extreme optimization. The graphical compromise was offset by greater production speed and standardized workflows. The paradox emerged precisely from this contrast. The Nintendo 64 had superior technical potential, but required considerable effort to be used effectively. PlayStation, despite starting from a simpler hardware base, was immediately productive. This difference turned theoretical power into a secondary factor compared to development efficiency. In the medium term, ease of programming became an industrial multiplier. PlayStation welcomed a growing number of productions that, while not reaching the technical refinement of the best Nintendo 64 titles, consistently and reliably exploited the machine's capabilities. The hardware was not pushed to its absolute limits, but was used systematically. In this sense, the comparison between the two consoles showed that technological superiority did not automatically guarantee a platform's success. The balance between power, accessibility, and development tools proved decisive, foreshadowing a lesson that would influence the entire design of consoles in the generations to come.
No style. He has no grace. This car has a funny face.
The three-dimensional rendering of the Nintendo 64 was characterized by an overall stable and homogeneous image. The system systematically applied texture filtering and anti-aliasing, significantly reducing the visual discontinuities typical of early 3D. Edges appeared less jagged, and the transition between surfaces was smoother, contributing to a perception of image solidity even in motion. However, this visual stability came with a series of compromises. The internal resolution was often lower than that of PlayStation titles, and the use of low-definition textures became a necessary choice to limit memory consumption. Bilinear filtering, while masking imperfections, accentuated the blurring effect, flattening details and making some surfaces visually indistinct. The image was consistent, but sacrificed sharpness. On PlayStation, the approach was the opposite. The absence of hardware filters made polygonal structures and texture distortions immediately visible, especially during camera movements. The so-called surface wobble and frequent clipping of scenic elements defined the console's aesthetic. However, this coarser rendering preserved the sharpness of textures and allowed for a clearer perception of visual details. Many developers interpreted this rawness as an expressive advantage. The greater apparent definition, combined with often higher resolution, favored darker, more realistic, or stylistically aggressive visual representations. Genres such as survival horror, racing simulations, and highly cinematic games benefited from this aesthetic, which resonated more with a mature audience. In direct comparison, the two consoles produced profoundly different images despite starting from the same goal: to make real-time 3D credible. Nintendo 64 aimed for visual continuity and readability of action, favoring colorful environments and rounded shapes. PlayStation accepted graphical instability as a compromise to achieve greater detail and more immediate visual impact. From these differences emerged two distinct aesthetic languages. Technical limitations were not simply endured, but integrated into the creative process. The result was a visual diversification that helped define recognizable identities, influencing not only the appearance of games, but also player expectations and the stylistic evolution of 3D in subsequent years. The introduction of the analog stick by the Nintendo 64 represented a structural turning point in how we interact with three-dimensional environments. For the first time, the speed and direction of movement were mapped continuously and proportionally, overcoming the binary logic of digital input. This allowed for gradual character control, essential for navigating complex spaces, adjusting trajectories, and managing the camera dynamically. The controller's design reflected this priority. The three-pronged shape was not a stylistic exercise, but a functional solution to integrate the stick as a central element of the experience. Games developed internally by Nintendo were built around this type of input from the earliest design stages. Super Mario 64 demonstrated how analog movement could become the very foundation of gameplay, influencing level design, camera management, and the pace of action. On PlayStation, the initial approach remained anchored to digital control. The original controller prioritized continuity with 2D, adapting three-dimensional games to a pre-existing input scheme. This imposed compromises in movement and precision, often resolved with rigid animations or indirect control systems. Only at a later stage did Sony introduce the dual analog and then the DualShock, recognizing the need for more flexible control. This evolution did not only happen on the hardware level, but directly influenced game design. Nintendo adopted a strongly iterative approach, based on constant testing and systematic refinement of mechanics. First-party titles were developed with the goal of ensuring a precise balance between accessibility and depth, reducing friction in control and making the gameplay immediately understandable. Sony, on the other hand, fostered a more heterogeneous context. The absence of a rigid initial standard gave developers ample room for decision-making. This led to very different control systems, some experimental, others imperfect, but often innovative. This freedom encouraged the birth of new genres and hybrid solutions, even at the cost of less uniform quality. In direct comparison, a clear distinction emerged. Nintendo conceived control as the foundation of the gaming experience, building games starting from physical interaction with the controller. Sony treated control as an adaptable component, subordinate to content variety and rapid production. These choices defined two different gameplay models, one based on precision and systemic consistency, the other on creative exploration and diversification of offerings. The Nintendo 64 library developed according to a selective model. The total number of titles remained contained, but most internal productions and close collaborations were handled with a high level of control. Every first-party release was treated as a strategic project with long development cycles and meticulous attention to balancing mechanics. Series like Mario, Zelda, Mario Kart, and Smash Bros. Not only solidified existing formulas, but introduced structural solutions that influenced 3D design, local multiplayer, and game space management. This approach generated a strongly identifiable catalog, where each title helped reinforce the platform's image. However, the almost exclusive reliance on internal productions and a few selected third parties made the library less responsive to emerging trends. Rapidly evolving genres, such as Japanese role-playing games or cinematic narrative experiences, found limited space, not for lack of interest, but due to incompatibility with the console's production and distribution constraints. PlayStation adopted the opposite strategy. The catalog expanded rapidly thanks to a constant influx of third-party productions, covering a wide range of genres and audiences. Japanese role-playing games found an ideal environment for serialization and narrative evolution. Survival horror established itself as an autonomous genre, while racing games focused on realistic models and official licenses. Even experimental and low-budget productions managed to reach the market, contributing to an unprecedented variety. This abundance did not imply a uniform quality level. Alongside major titles, there were also minor productions, often created in a short time. However, from an industrial perspective, volume became a competitive advantage. The Sony console offered third parties an ecosystem where risk was distributed across a wide and continuously growing audience, reducing dependence on the success of individual titles. The relationship with external developers therefore proved decisive. Nintendo maintained tight control, prioritizing consistency and perceived quality, but limiting diversification. Sony incentivized production through contained costs, streamlined procedures, and greater creative autonomy. This favored the migration of studios historically linked to Nintendo towards PlayStation, structurally altering the balance of the industry. A clear distinction emerged in the comparison between the two libraries. Nintendo 64 built a compact, recognizable, and highly influential catalog in terms of design. PlayStation developed a vast and stratified archive, capable of intercepting different tastes and rapidly adapting to market transformations. Two different models, both consistent, that decisively contributed to defining the identity and commercial destiny of their respective platforms. Nintendo's communication strategy remained consistent with the identity it had built in the 1980s. The brand continued to present video games as a family-friendly, accessible, and controlled experience. Advertising campaigns favored vibrant colors, smiling faces, and reassuring domestic settings. The implicit message was one of continuity. Nintendo did not seek to redefine its audience, but to consolidate an existing relationship of trust with parents and younger players. This approach reduced risks but limited the brand's expansion into new demographic segments. The communication deliberately avoided provocative tones or explicit references to the emerging youth culture of the 1990s. Video games were presented as a structured recreational activity, separate from other forms of adult entertainment. In this sense, Nintendo defended a precise cultural boundary, choosing not to engage with a segment of the audience transitioning from adolescence to adulthood. Sony adopted a radically different strategy. The launch of PlayStation was accompanied by a communication that broke with traditional industry codes. Campaigns used abstract imagery, rapid edits, electronic music, and ambiguous slogans. Video games were associated with club culture, urban fashion, and visual experimentation, positioning themselves alongside other contemporary entertainment products, like music and cinema. This choice not only changed the tone, but redefined the message's recipient. PlayStation did not speak to children, but to young adults accustomed to consuming pop culture across various media. Video games were presented as an expression of style and identity, not merely a pastime. The act of playing took on a social value, independent of age and family context. The impact of this strategy was structural. For the first time, a console was perceived as a cool object, integrated into the urban youth imagination. This contributed to normalizing video games as an adult form of entertainment, expanding the user base and changing the public perception of the medium. The audience did not just grow numerically, but also changed in composition. In direct comparison, two opposing communication models emerged. Nintendo preserved a protective and institutional narrative, reinforcing its historical identity. Sony transformed communication into a tool for cultural disruption, using it to redefine the role of video games in society. This divergence decisively contributed to making video games a transversal phenomenon, capable of engaging with languages, ages, and contexts previously considered alien to the sector. The sales results of PlayStation and Nintendo 64 did not only represent a quantitative difference, but highlighted two divergent industrial trajectories. PlayStation's surpassing of the 100 million unit mark was the result of a widespread diffusion, supported by a constant market presence over a prolonged period and a gradual reduction in hardware price. Sony's console maintained commercial relevance even in the last years of its life cycle, continuing to attract new users. Nintendo 64, despite a solid start in certain territories, showed a shorter and more concentrated sales curve. The dependence on highly anticipated first-party releases generated intermittent peaks, but failed to sustain consistent growth over time. The absence of a continuous flow of new productions limited audience expansion, especially in markets where competition with PlayStation was more aggressive. Sony's commercial success had implications that went beyond the single hardware. PlayStation established itself as a reference platform for developers and publishers, creating a virtuous circle between catalog breadth, increased installed base, and further content attraction. This model solidified the idea of the console as an ecosystem, where value resided not only in the machine, but in the network of products and services surrounding it. From a global market perspective, PlayStation demonstrated that video games could overcome traditional demographic segmentations. The console found its place in diverse cultural contexts, adapting to local tastes and regional trends without losing brand consistency. This penetration capability transformed video games into a transversal consumer good, comparable to other mass entertainment media. Nintendo, on the other hand, maintained a more defined and recognizable position. Its target audience remained strongly tied to the brand's historical identity, ensuring a solid but less expandable base. This choice preserved the brand's value in the long run, but reduced its immediate impact on global sales. In the final comparison, the numbers sanctioned a structural transformation of the sector. PlayStation's success was not just a commercial victory, but the confirmation of a new industrial model, where scale, accessibility, and cultural positioning became determining factors. The Nintendo 64 PlayStation generation thus marked the definitive transition of video games from a specialized market to a global entertainment industry. Over the course of that console generation, Nintendo directly experienced the effects of a highly centralized strategy. The choice to maintain strict control over media formats, licenses, and production processes limited the system's flexibility. Studios historically tied to the brand, accustomed to wider operating margins, found themselves facing high costs, technical constraints, and rigid production timelines. In many cases, the economic viability of projects was compromised, leading several developers to reconsider their position. This progressive reduction in external support wasn't immediate, but cumulative. Each canceled or downsized project contributed to eroding the variety of offerings. Nintendo partially compensated with top-tier internal productions, but the model proved not to be scalable. The platform became increasingly reliant on a limited number of teams, increasing the industrial risk associated with each individual release. Sony adopted an opposite strategy, based on building lasting relationships with third parties. The company didn't just provide competitive hardware, but invested in creating an environment conducive to development, continuous technical support, less restrictive licensing policies, and constant dialogue with publishers of all sizes. This approach transformed PlayStation into a platform perceived as reliable and economically predictable. Over time, this trust translated into a structural advantage. Third parties began to consider PlayStation as their primary platform, planning productions based on its characteristics and audience. The relationship was no longer opportunistic, but strategic. This bond allowed Sony to approach subsequent generations from a position of strength with an already consolidated ecosystem. The consequences of this confrontation went beyond individual brands. The industry assimilated a key lesson. The success of a console didn't depend solely on the quality of first-party games or hardware power, but on the ability to support a broad and diverse production ecosystem. The role of third parties emerged as a central element in defining the value of a platform. In the long run, this dynamic helped redefine the sector's priorities. Subsequent consoles were designed with increasing attention to ease of development, standardization of tools, and reduction of entry barriers. The confrontation between Nintendo and Sony in this generation thus left a concrete legacy. It demonstrated that the balance between control and openness was one of the decisive factors for the sustainability and growth of the video game industry. The legacy of Nintendo 64 primarily shaped the language of video games. The solutions introduced were not temporary fads, but defined design principles destined to become standards. The transition to 3D was not approached as a simple extension of 2D, but as a radical rethinking of the game space. Camera management, the construction of explorable environments, and the use of analog movement imposed new rules, which directly influenced the design of three-dimensional games in subsequent years. This legacy was not measured in quantity, but in depth. Nintendo's innovations became technical and conceptual references, studied and re-elaborated even by those who had not developed on the platform. Analog control, The relationship between input and character physics, the readability of three-dimensional space, became part of the common vocabulary of game design. In this sense, Nintendo 64 acted as a laboratory for fundamental solutions rather than a driving force for market expansion. PlayStation produced an impact of a different nature, but equally profound. Its legacy concerned the very structure of the industry. PlayStation demonstrated that video games could function as a mass cultural medium, free from a precise age-based identity. The console did not merely sell hardware, but normalized video games as a global consumer product, capable of coexisting with music, cinema, and television. This change altered the priorities of the sector. Attention shifted from the single experience to the platform as an ecosystem. Value was attributed to the variety of the offering, the ability to attract different audiences, and the continuity of support over time. Sony helped establish an industrial model based on scale, accessibility, and cultural integration, which would become dominant in subsequent generations. In the comparison between the two legacies, a historical complementarity emerged. Nintendo 64 defined how to play in 3 dimensions. PlayStation redefined for whom and why one played. One acted on the internal language of the medium, the other on its external positioning in society. The final result was not the victory of one vision over the other, but an irreversible transformation of video gaming. After this generation, the medium could no longer return to being either an exclusively technical product or a niche entertainment. The encounter and clash between Nintendo 64 and PlayStation marked the moment when video games acquired a dual identity, a complex design discipline and a global cultural industry. From that point onward, every console would have to contend with both these legacies. And with this, our journey into the past comes to an end. How many of these fun facts did you already know? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Thank you for watching Retro Legends, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay retro, stay legends.